Laurel County, Kentucky. The kind of place where time forgets to move forward. In 1982, tobacco was still king, and the Barker family sat on what was left of a throne built from leaf and labor. Their land stretched across 200 acres of low hills and ridgelines, carved by mule and sweat. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county, but it was the one people pointed to when they talked about real tobacco men. The Barkers had been growing burley since the days of the Spanish-American War, 4 generations deep, and every one of them buried under that same soil. The patriarch, John Eli Barker, known simply as Eli, was 47 that fall. Broad-shouldered, bearded, and quiet-spoken, he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved with a hatchet. Blunt lines, thick brow, hard eyes. He didn't smile much, and when he did, it never quite reached his mouth. Eli didn't go into town unless he had to. He didn't trust the banks, didn't own a television, and believed in 3 things without question: God, family, and the price of cured tobacco. His younger brothers, Noah and Simon, worked the farm with him. Both carried the same Barker jaw and the same streak of stubborn pride that ran back through generations. There was a 4th brother once, Caleb, but the war had taken him in 1971, and the family didn't talk much about that anymore. Just a folded flag and a grave near the creek. The year had started with hope. Spring rains came on time. The seedlings took strong. By July, the fields rolled in neat green waves across the hills, plants waist-high and reaching. The curing barns were patched and ready. I said it looked like it might be the best crop since '78. But under that hope was something brittle. Everyone knew prices were falling. The big buyers were getting restless. The federal quotas were changing, and rumors whispered through the region that this might be the last year the Burley Stabilization Corporation would offer guaranteed contracts. Without that contract, farms like the Barkers weren't worth the dirt under their boots. Still, they worked like salvation was at the end of every row. The barns filled with gold leaf bundles, strung and hung with precision. The air turned sharp with the scent of drying tobacco, sweet and bitter, and old as time. Each leaf mattered. Every stalk was a promise to the past. That's when the hands arrived. Seasonal workers, 10 of them. Most came from 3 counties over, some from farther, hired on the cheap to help with the cutting and hanging. The Barker brothers didn't ask questions. Men who needed work came with shadows, and in rural Kentucky, you didn't shine a light where it wasn't invited. They set up in the bunkhouse, a converted corn crib with cots, a hot plate, and a promise of $20 a day, and hot meals if they kept their mouths shut and their backs bent. Eli watched them with the same suspicion he gave outsiders and government men. These weren't farm boys. They laughed too loud, smoked too much, and didn't treat the barns with the reverence they deserved. But they worked, at first, until the night someone broke into the lower barn. Eli found it at dawn. The padlock twisted off, the door swung wide. Inside, chaos. Rope cut, leaves scattered. A third of the crop trampled or torn. Fresh footprints in the dust. Not animals, not vandals. Intentional, personal. like someone wanted the Barkers to bleed. He didn't speak as he walked the rows, just looked. Then he turned to his brothers and said 3 words. This was inside. The implication was clear. No stranger would risk this. No outsider would find the path through the back holler, past the dead oak and the broken fence line. This was done by someone sleeping under their roof. And that was when something old and dark began to stir in the Barker men. Something handed down like a family Bible. You don't ruin a man's field. You don't spit on the hand that feeds you. And you sure as hell don't cross a Barker in their own barn. They weren't all bad men. That was the thing Eli Barker couldn't shake. A few of them, maybe 4, had honest eyes and hard hands. Good workers, respectful, quiet. But the others? Trouble wrapped in denim and sweat. Fast with a joke, lazy with a rake, careless around the leaves like they didn't know the value of what hung above their heads. There was Darrell, the one who smiled too much. Gold tooth, loud mouth, always telling stories that didn't add up. Said he worked tobacco down near Harlan but didn't know the difference between a primer and a stripper. Then there was Marcus, eyes like wet coal, never said more than a few words but watched everything. Eli didn't like the way he looked at the barn, like he saw more than he should. The youngest one, Jonah, couldn't have been more than 18. Skinny as a fence post, with a nervous laugh and a stutter when he got excited. Eli felt a flicker of pity for him. The boy didn't seem built for hard work, but he tried. And that counted for something. Each day started before sunup. They'd gather at the edge of the field, boots heavy with dew, breathing steam into the cold morning air. The Barker brothers gave orders, which barn, which rows, how deep to cut, how to carry without bruising the leaf. Most listened. A few didn't. Twice, Eli caught Darrell dropping bundles too hard. Once, he found a cigarette butt, smoldering near the curing shed. He didn't say a word then, just locked eyes with the man who dropped it and pointed to the barn wall, blackened from a fire back in '58. That blaze had taken a full quarter of their crop and nearly took their grandfather's life with it. Fire was no joke in a tobacco barn. By mid-September, things were tense. The damaged crop from the break-in had sent them scrambling to fill quotas. Every leaf mattered now, every hour of labor. And still, some of the workers treated it like a joke, slacking off when backs were turned, gambling in the bunkhouse, sneaking out after dark. Then came the carving. Eli found it scratched into one of the beams in the upper barn. A name, Barker, with a line drawn through it and a crude drawing of a noose. He didn't say anything to his brothers, not yet. Just ran his hand over the mark like it might explain something. That night he gathered the workers and told them one simple rule. The barns are sacred, he said. They feed us, clothe us, keep this farm alive. You treat them with care, or you leave. Simple as that. No one spoke, not even Darrell. But Eli saw the glance exchanged between Marcus and another man, Raymond, a big bruiser with a busted nose and arms like fence posts. That's when he knew. One of them, maybe more, had done the damage. And if the sheriff wouldn't get involved, then someone else would. Noah wanted to fire the whole crew. Simon said, "Wait, watch." Catch them in the act. Eli just stared at the hills beyond the field the way his father used to do when something went wrong. He said one thing, low and cold. "We'll handle it our way." And just like that, the line was drawn. Not with law, but with blood. The second strike hit harder than the first. It was a Saturday morning, 5 days after the warning speech. Eli woke early before the rooster, before the dew even set. Something felt wrong. A knot behind the ribs, a stiffness in his hands that wasn't just age or work. When he stepped outside, he smelled it. Not smoke, not rot, but wet tobacco. Fresh. Violated. He didn't call for his brothers. Didn't need to. They met him halfway down the hill, drawn by instinct or maybe the same cold premonition that gripped his chest. They walked in silence toward the south field, where the last of the high nicotine burley stood waiting to be cut. What they found stopped them cold. Leaves, hundreds of them, lay shredded in the dirt like feathers after a fox raid. Not broken by weather, not dropped from sickness. Slashed with blades. Ripped and scattered. The damage wasn't just to the plants. The posts had been kicked loose. The ropes sliced. Even the tarps had been torn. Simon knelt down, lifted a stalk, examined the cut. Straight edge, not a machete. Box knife, maybe. Noah picked up one of the ruined leaves, crumbled it slowly in his palm. They knew what they were doing, knew where to hurt us. Eli stood still, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight it ached. He wasn't looking at the damage anymore. He was staring past it, at the horizon, at the barn, at the bunkhouse. They walked the field in slow circles. No tire tracks, just boots. Mud-crushed imprints leading from the fence line to the rows and back again. At least 3 sets, maybe more. Someone had come under the dark and stayed long enough to carve vengeance into their harvest. By mid-morning, they gathered what they could. What wasn't ruined was rushed to the barn for curing. But the weight in Eli's chest didn't ease. It just hardened. After lunch, they walked to the bunkhouse. 10 men sat on cots or leaned against the walls, shirtless, sweating, loud. The poker table was out, a few bills scattered. Someone laughed when the Barkers walked in. It stopped quickly. Eli didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just looked at each man one by one, like he was carving their faces into memory. "Someone touched what they shouldn't have," he said. "Ruined what keeps this place alive. We don't know who. Not yet. But the man who did it? He'll answer for it. I swear on every bone buried in these hills." Marcus met his gaze, cool as pond water. "You got proof?" Eli's voice didn't shift. "Not yet." Raymond leaned forward, arms on his knees. "Then maybe you ought to watch where you point your threats." Simon took a half step forward. Noah put a hand on his chest, held him back. They weren't ready. Not yet. Eli stepped closer to the center of the room. "We ain't calling the law. That's not how this gets handled. You know something? Now's your time to speak." Silence. A long one. Jonah opened his mouth, then closed it. The boy looked terrified. Finally, Eli turned, slow and deliberate. "Then we'll figure it out ourselves." That night, no one slept easy. The Barkers took turns sitting on the porch, rifles across their laps. A storm rolled in from the west, thunder slow and distant, like footsteps behind you that won't stop. In the bunkhouse, 3 men didn't sleep at all. One of them whispered, "We went too far." The others said nothing. By sunrise, the Barkers had already begun to plan, and none of those plans involved forgiveness. The Barkers weren't violent by nature. They weren't saints either, not by a damn sight, but they kept their violence buried deep, like a shotgun behind a barn door, not for show, not for warning, but for the moment when talking stopped working and the rules changed. And in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, the rules had always been simple. You don't steal what's not yours. You don't damage a man's field. And you never, ever forget the debt that's owed. By Monday, the brothers had turned that old code into action. Eli laid out the plan in the barn. The same barn where his father had taught him to tie tobacco bundles. The same place where they'd stored the last good crop before the price collapse of '79. "This ain't for rage," he said. "This ain't to feel better. This is to set things right." Simon was the first to speak. "We talking blood?" Noah just looked down. He didn't need to say yes. His silence meant more than agreement. It meant commitment. Eli nodded. "Not all of them, not yet. But someone's going to talk." That afternoon they tested the group. Simple things. Cut the rations. Switched the bunkhouse water to the older well, the one with the rust taste. Took the radio away. Watched who complained, who muttered when they thought no one was listening. Daryl cracked first. Loud, obnoxious, pacing outside the bunkhouse, yelling about fairness, about respect. Simon waited until he was alone behind the shed, then grabbed him by the collar and pressed him against the wall. "You ruined our field?" Simon asked, soft. "I don't know what you're talking about, man." Simon pressed harder. "You ever been in a fire, Daryl? Ever hear a man scream when his skin cooks?" Daryl's eyes went wide. He shook his head, too fast. "I didn't do nothing, swear to God. But I know who did." That was all Simon needed. By sunset, the Barker brothers had a name. Raymond. The one with the busted nose and the cocky walk. The one who never pulled his weight, but always had an opinion. The one who'd been mouthing off since day one. He bragged about it, Daryl said. Said it'd teach you rednecks a lesson. Said he slashed the stalks and pissed on your tarps. Said you were all too scared to do anything about it. Eli didn't smile, he just nodded. That night, the brothers met behind the equipment shed. Lantern light, 3 rifles, no hesitation. "We deal with Raymond," Eli said. "But we do it clean, no mess, no scene." Noah asked the question they were all thinking. "What if the others get in the way?" Eli paused. "Then they go too." The next evening, they invited the whole crew to the barn. Told them it was time to move the cured bundles. Said they'd feed them afterward. Let them sit at the Barker table. That old mountain hospitality. 10 men walked in. The barn door creaked shut behind them. A bolt slid home. And the only light came from the single flickering lantern overhead, and the kerosene can sitting by the wall. The codes of the mountain weren't written down. They were lived, and they were about to be burned into history. The barn smelled like old wood, dust, and cured leaf, the air thick with a sweetness that had soaked into the beams over decades. The 10 workers stood clustered near the center, shifting their weight, hands in pockets, eyes darting toward the walls. They could feel it now. Whatever story they'd been told to get them inside had already died. Eli Barker stood near the door, lantern in hand, the yellow flame throwing long shadows across the rafters. Noah leaned against a post with his arms folded, rifle slung across his back. Simon stayed closer to the wall, silent, watchful, his presence heavy as iron. Raymond broke first. "What's this about?" he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "You said we were moving bundles." "We are," Eli replied. "Just not the way you thought." The bolt slid fully into place with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Several men jumped. Jonah took a step backward, bumping into another worker, his breath coming quick and shallow. Raymond laughed, sharp and forced. "This ain't funny. You can't just lock us in here." Eli lifted the lantern slightly, light catching Raymond's face. "You cut our crop. You pissed on our work. You thought it was a joke." Raymond's smile vanished. "You don't got proof." Simon moved then, fast. His fist came out of nowhere, smashing into Raymond's mouth. The sound was wet and final. Raymond hit the dirt hard, teeth scattering across the floor like white pebbles. The barn erupted. 2 men rushed Simon. Noah swung the rifle stock, catching one across the ribs, the crack of bone loud in the enclosed space. Another worker tried to run for the door. Eli stepped into his path and shoved him back with one hard hand to the chest. "No one leaves," Eli said, voice steady. "Not yet." Darrell dropped to his knees, hands up, sobbing. "I told you who it was. I told you everything." "I know," Eli said. "That don't change what happened." Jonah curled against a post, rocking, whispering prayers so fast the words blurred together. Raymond tried to stand. Blood ran down his chin, dark against the dirt. "You're all dead for this," he spat. "Sheriff's gonna—" Simon kicked him back down. "Ain't no sheriff here." The beating didn't last long. It wasn't about rage. It was about control. When the dust settled, Raymond lay gasping, face swollen, eyes unfocused. The others stood in a loose circle, fear thick enough to taste. Eli walked to the wall and picked up the kerosene can. That changed everything. "Listen," he said. "We're going to ask one last time. Who helped him?" No one spoke. Eli twisted the cap loose. The sharp, oily smell spread instantly, cutting through the sweetness of tobacco. A few men started shouting. One rushed Eli and was tackled by Noah, driven face first into the dirt. "You don't get to rush this," Eli said. He poured the fuel slowly along the base of the walls, not splashing, not wild, careful, deliberate, each step measured. "This was your choice," Eli continued. "You crossed a line. You damaged what fed my family. You laughed about it." Jonah screamed. "I didn't do nothing. I swear I just needed the work." Eli stopped pouring, looked at the boy. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Then it hardened. "You stayed," he said. "That's enough." Simon struck the match. The flame danced small and harmless for half a second before Eli dropped it. The fire ran fast, racing along the kerosene trail, climbing the walls with a roar that swallowed every sound. The screaming started almost immediately. Fire moves faster than fear. By the time the men realized what was happening, the flames were already crawling up the walls, licking the beams, turning dry tobacco into fuel. Smoke poured down from the rafters, thick and black, burning eyes and lungs in seconds. Raymond was the first to reach the door. He slammed into it with his shoulder, again and again, screaming until his voice shredded. The bolt held. The wood groaned, but didn't give. Simon stood on the other side, back pressed to the planks, teeth clenched, listening to the sound of bone and desperation. Inside, chaos reigned. Men clawed at the walls. One tried to climb the hanging poles and fell, tangled in burning leaves. Another tripped and didn't get back up. Jonah screamed for his mother until smoke swallowed his words. Eli backed away from the door. Lantern dropped. Flame lost in the growing inferno. His hands shook now. Not much. Just enough to notice. "We gotta go," Noah said. His face was pale, eyes reflecting the fire. Now. They moved together, fast, practiced. Simon released the pressure from the door just long enough to slip free, then slammed it shut again. The bolt slid home for the final time. From inside, fists pounded, voices begged. Promises were made to gods that weren't listening. The Barkers didn't answer. They walked away from the barn as the roof began to glow. Flames burst through the slats, lighting the night sky orange. The sound was constant. Wood cracking, metal warping, men screaming until there were no screams left. They didn't look back. By the time the roof collapsed inward, the brothers were halfway down the hill. Simon stumbled once and dropped to his knees, retching into the grass. Noah stood frozen, staring at the fire like he couldn't process what he'd done. Eli grabbed him by the shoulder. "Keep moving." The barn burned hot and fast. Dry leaf, old wood, years of dust and memory feeding the blaze. By dawn, there was nothing left but a blackened frame and smoking ruin. The Barker brothers sat on the porch as the sun rose, silence heavy between them. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. When the sheriff arrived, it was already too late. Eli met him at the gate, hat in hand, face drawn. "Faulty? Lantern," he said. "Barn caught. Men were inside." The sheriff looked past him at the smoking wreckage. Door was locked. Eli didn't flinch. "We lock it every night. Animals." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then he nodded. "Fire marshal will want to look." "Of course," Eli said. By noon, the county was buzzing. 10 men dead, burned beyond recognition. A tragedy, they called it, a terrible accident. But some things don't burn clean. The lock lay twisted in the ash, blackened but intact. The pattern of the fire told a story the smoke couldn't hide. And in Frankfurt, a man whose job was to listen to what fires say was already packing his bag. The mountains had swallowed the screams, but they hadn't erased the truth. The fire was still breathing when dawn reached Laurel County. Thick columns of smoke rose from the blackened skeleton of the barn, drifting low across the hills like a warning that refused to fade. The smell carried for miles, sharp and oily, clinging to clothes and skin. Neighbors woke with it in their throats and stepped onto porches to stare toward the Barker land, where the sky still glowed faintly orange, even after the flames had died. Volunteer firefighters arrived first, boots crunching through ash, faces drawn tight with the understanding that nothing could be saved. They sprayed water out of duty more than hope, hissing steam into the ruins. When one of them kicked aside a fallen beam and saw what lay beneath, he staggered back and tore off his helmet. No one had to ask what he'd found. By mid-morning, word had spread through the county. 10 men, all inside. No survivors. The sheriff cordoned off the area with yellow tape, though it felt useless against something this final. Deputies stood around in uneasy silence, hats pulled low, eyes refusing to linger too long on the wreckage. Most of them had grown up in tobacco country. They knew barns, they knew fire, and they knew when something didn't sit right. The bodies were barely bodies anymore, burned beyond recognition, curled into shapes that spoke of panic and pain. One was found near the door, hands fused together as if still pounding against the wood. Another lay beneath a collapsed rafter, skull split clean. They were placed gently into black bags, each movement slow, almost reverent. Eli Barker watched from the edge of the tape. He stood with Noah and Simon beside him, shoulders squared, faces hollowed out. He answered questions when asked. Short answers, steady voice, faulty lantern. Locked door was routine. Men must have panicked. No one accused him, not out loud. But the looks lingered. By afternoon, the county fire marshal arrived. Harold Whitaker, tall to thin, gray-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. He walked the site without speaking, crouched near the foundation, studied the scorch patterns along the ground. He ran a gloved hand over the warped lock, pulled from the debris, and frowned. "This burned hot," he said finally. "Hotter than a lantern accident." The sheriff shifted. "Tobacco burns fast." Whitaker nodded. "It does, but fire leaves signatures. It tells you where it started, how it moved." He stood and looked at Eli for a long moment. "You mind if I bring in state review?" Eli met his gaze. "Do what you have to." The sun dipped lower as the last of the bodies were removed. The barn that had fed the Barkers for generations was reduced to a scorched footprint. Ash blew across the fields, settling into the soil like a curse. That night the Barker house was silent. No supper cooked, no prayers spoken. Simon sat on the back steps, staring into the dark until his eyes burned. Noah paced the yard like a caged animal. Eli stayed inside, hands wrapped around a mug he never drank from. The screams came later. Simon heard them first. Not real screams, not exactly. More like echoes, carried on memory instead of air. He pressed his palms against his ears until his jaw hurt. But the sound stayed. Noah vomited behind the shed before midnight, retching until there was nothing left. He stayed there a long time afterward, curled on the ground, whispering apologies to no one. Eli didn't sleep at all. He sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the wall where his father's hat still hung. He told himself it was done, that justice had been served, that the fields would survive. But when the wind shifted and the smell of smoke drifted back in through the open window, his hands began to shake. And somewhere far away in a quiet office in Frankfurt, Harold Whitaker began writing a report that would change everything. By the second day, the story had settled into place. A tragic accident, a faulty lantern, men trapped by panic and smoke. It was the version printed in the local paper, spoken over diner counters, repeated at church steps. People shook their heads and sighed. Tobacco barns burned. It happened. Everyone knew that. But not everyone believed it. The widows arrived before the week was out. Not all 10 had families nearby, but 3 did. One drove in from Hazard, another from across the state line. They stood together at the edge of the ruins, clutching purses and folded coats, eyes rimmed red and searching for answers that wouldn't come. One of them, Margaret Ellis, didn't cry. She stared at the ground where the barn had stood and said nothing. Her husband had written her letters when he was away. Long ones. Careful ones. She carried the last of them folded in her pocket. The sheriff met them all with sympathy and practiced distance. He explained the investigation, the fire marshal's review, the delays. He did not mention the lock. Eli Barker attended the funeral service held for the workers in a borrowed hall outside town. He stood at the back, hat in hand, eyes down. Some people nodded at him. Others looked away. No one spoke to him directly. When Harold Whitaker returned with a second investigator, the air changed. They brought dogs, equipment, notebooks. They spent hours sifting through ash and earth, marking patterns, measuring depth. They spoke in low voices and didn't smile. Whitaker asked questions again, this time differently. Where exactly had the lantern been kept? Who locked the barn? Who had last entered? Simon answered one too quickly. Noah avoided eye contact. Whitaker noticed. He drove away that evening without saying a word, leaving behind the sense that something had been disturbed that couldn't be put back. At the Barker house, tension coiled tight. Noah stopped eating. Simon stopped talking. Eli carried on as if nothing had changed, but the lines in his face deepened, carved by something heavier than age. When the fire marshal's preliminary findings came back, the sheriff read them twice. Accelerant present. Fire origin inconsistent with lantern ignition. Door secured from outside. The sheriff closed the folder and sat back heavily. He'd grown up with the Barkers. He'd hunted with their father. He knew what kind of men they were, or thought he did. He drove out to the farm just before sunset. Eli met him at the porch. They're saying it wasn't an accident, the sheriff said. Eli nodded once. They always say that when they don't understand the land. The sheriff studied him. You telling me straight? Eli didn't blink. I told you what happened. The sheriff left without another word. That night, Margaret Ellis returned home and opened the letter her husband had written before the fire. It was short, nervous. He said the Barkers were watching them, said something bad was coming, said if anything happened, it wasn't an accident. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. The next morning she drove to the sheriff's office and handed him the truth. The letter changed everything. It was only 3 paragraphs long, written in careful block print. No accusations, no names, just worry. Plain and quiet. A man sensing that the ground beneath him was about to crack open. The sheriff read it 3 times, each pass heavier than the last. Margaret Ellis had handed it to him with shaking fingers and eyes that hadn't slept. Her husband, Walter, hadn't been a liar. He wasn't the kind to exaggerate. If he'd said something felt off, it was because it was. The sheriff called Frankfurt again. Within 24 hours, Harold Whitaker was back in Laurel County, this time with a full team and an evidence van. He didn't speak to the Barkers. Not yet. He didn't speak to the press either. But he walked the perimeter of the ruined barn like he was tracing a memory. One he hadn't lived through, but could almost feel. They dug deeper this time. Samples from the dirt under the barn floor, chemical residue taken from the beams that had not fully collapsed. One splinter, preserved in the ash, tested positive for kerosene. Not lantern fuel, not oil. Kerosene. Poured, not spilled. The bolt that had held the door shut was examined under magnification. The burn patterns didn't match spontaneous combustion. The flames had started near the eastern wall, moved outward in a curve, almost as if guided. On Thursday, Whitaker requested access to the Barker property. He brought the sheriff with him. Eli met them on the porch, arms crossed, body still as stone. Simon and Noah stood behind him, silent sentries. Whitaker was polite, formal. He explained the findings without raising his voice. "Mr. Barker, what you told us, Bumby, about the lantern, the door, the cause, it doesn't match what we're seeing." Eli didn't flinch. "You think I killed those men?" "I think," Whitaker said slowly, "that something happened here that goes beyond an accident." Eli's voice remained even. "I told you everything I know." The silence stretched. The sheriff shifted beside Whitaker but said nothing. Whitaker nodded. "Then we'll keep looking." They left without searching the house, without making an arrest. But the air was different now, heavier, like a storm had started gathering above the hills, quiet but certain. In town, whispers turned into conversations. At the diner, people stopped mid-sentence when the Barker name was spoken. At church, hands hesitated before shaking. Respect turned brittle. Eli noticed. He didn't say anything, but his eyes moved slower now, watching, calculating, the way you do when your back starts to feel warm and there's nothing behind you but the edge of a cliff. That night, the family ate dinner in silence. Martha, Eli's wife, cleared plates without comment. She hadn't asked questions since the fire. She didn't need to. She had lived on this land her entire life. She knew what silence meant. When the children were asleep and the moon cast long shadows across the porch, she looked at Eli and said only one thing. "They'll come." Eli nodded. "I know." She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Margaret Ellis didn't want to be involved. That much was clear. She'd lived in quiet corners her whole life, married young, raised 2 boys before the illness took them both in the span of 5 years. Walter had been her anchor after that, a quiet man with worn hands and a kind voice. He hadn't had much to give, but he gave it without asking for anything in return. When he took the job on the Barker farm, she had worried, not because of the work, but because of the distance. Laurel County wasn't far, but it felt like another world, a world run by men who said little and held grudges for lifetimes. The last letter Walter wrote her had arrived 2 days before the fire. She hadn't read it at first. Too tired, too busy. She let it sit on the counter with the unpaid bills and half-filled shopping lists. After the fire, after the phone call, she found it again, opened it with trembling hands. He'd written about the tension in the barn, about Eli's silence and Simon's stare, about the way the workers whispered at night, worried something was coming but too afraid to run. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't name names, but every line was filled with fear. "I think I might have picked the wrong field," he'd written. "I just hope I get paid before something breaks." She read that line again and again until it seared into her. When she gave the letter to the sheriff, she felt like she was handing over her husband's last breath. She didn't cry. She didn't speak, just nodded once and left. That note was now in Frankfurt, being photocopied, logged, scrutinized. Investigators began interviewing surviving family members of the other workers. Patterns emerged. Rumors of threats, of missing pay, of broken rules, met with sudden silence, no proof, but the kind of weight that gathers over time until it forces the door open. One deputy started mapping worker movement during the final week. Who had left the bunkhouse when? Who had returned late? Who had tried to quit and been told to ride it out? The threads formed a net, and at the center of that net sat Eli Barker, still silent, still certain, still pretending that the fire had burned everything it needed to. But Margaret Ellis's note had survived, and embers like truth don't stay buried forever. The Barker land had always been worth more in memory than money. But tobacco had changed that. For nearly a century, the fields paid the bills. The barns filled with leaf that turned into cash. A good harvest could buy a new tractor, pay off a loan, keep food on the table through winter. And every year, the Barkers counted on that contract, the one with the Burley Tobacco Growers Cooperative, to make it all worth it. But in 1982, the market shifted. Demand dropped. Quotas tightened. That summer, the Barker contract had been cut in half. The buyer said it was just business. But Eli knew better. It was survival. The big farms were eating the small ones, and families like his were the ones choking on the dirt. When the lower barn was vandalized, a third of the crop ruined, stomped and slashed, the consequences weren't just emotional. It was money lost, contract threatened. Without enough weight, the co-op wouldn't buy. No payout, no profit. The farm would fall, and Eli would not let that happen. That night, after they discovered the damage, the Barker brothers sat in the kitchen, counting the remaining bundles. Eli did the math in his head, lips moving silently. When he was done, he stood and poured 3 glasses of bourbon. He said nothing, just handed each brother a glass and stared at the floor. Noah understood first. "We ain't gonna make quota." Simon was slower to speak. We could borrow from the bank. Eli shook his head. They won't give us another cent. What then? Eli drained his glass. We fix it. Those 3 words carried weight, not just a plan, a sentence, a blood oath. The following week, the fire claimed 10 lives. Workers, men who knew too much, who stayed too long, who didn't walk away when they should have. And whether it was vengeance or desperation or both, the result was the same. Ash where the problem used to be. After the blaze, Eli called the co-op representative. He told him there had been a fire, that some of the crop was lost, but that they'd still meet the weight. The buyer was skeptical, but Eli made a promise. You'll get what we owe. He meant it. The Barkers worked day and night, pulled old bundles from storage, repackaged what hadn't been damaged, cut corners on quality, used water to make the leaf heavier. It was enough. Just barely. The contract was honored. The check came 2 weeks later. Enough to cover the mortgage. Enough to keep the farm from slipping through their hands. Martha watched Eli open the envelope. He didn't smile. Just folded the check and put it in the drawer beside his father's pocket knife. Was it worth it? She asked. Eli didn't answer, but she already knew. Anna Barker had once been the voice of the family. Matriarch in every sense, she ruled with a quiet strength that held the house together long after her husband died in 76. It was her hands that stitched clothes, her voice that sang over supper, her prayers that blanketed the family when storms rolled through the hills. But after the fire, she stopped speaking. At first, it seemed like grief. 10 men dead, even if she didn't know their names, even if they weren't blood, it was still death, and death deserved silence. But it wasn't mourning that kept her quiet, it was knowing. She hadn't asked questions, but she'd seen the signs. The brothers whispering near the porch, the sudden tension in Simon's shoulders, the quiet, careful way Eli moved in the days leading up to the fire, the smell of kerosene on their clothes. She sat in her rocking chair by the window, the same chair she'd rocked all 4 of her boys in as infants. She watched the wind move through the empty fields, watched the blackened barn crumble inward under the weight of time and weather. She said nothing. When the sheriff came by to ask questions, she offered him lemonade and a place to sit, but her answers were short, polite, empty. You think your sons had anything to do with it? He asked gently. She looked him in the eye and said, My sons are good men. It wasn't a lie, not to her. Good men do bad things when they're cornered, when their family is threatened, when the land that fed them is on the brink of being taken away. She'd seen that truth up close, during the Depression, during the war, after Caleb never came home. You survive or you don't. And the Barkers always survived. At night, Anna lit a candle in the window. She said it was for the souls lost in the fire. But deep down, it was also for her sons, a small flame to keep the dark from swallowing them whole. Martha came to her one evening, hands shaking, voice low. I think they'll arrest him. Anna didn't flinch. Then he'll carry it. Do you think he regrets it? Anna finally looked away from the window. It doesn't matter. Outside, the wind carried the scent of fall. The fields were bare. The harvest was over. The season had ended, and with it, something inside the Barker family had gone cold. But Anna stayed silent, because silence was protection. It was legacy. It was the only thing left to pass down now. The second excavation began under gray skies and a cold wind that carried the smell of rain. State investigators returned to the Barker property with fresh authority and quiet resolve. This time, they were not looking for answers. They were looking for confirmation. The barn site was cordoned off again. Shovels broke through layers of ash and collapsed timber, exposing the darker earth beneath. What had once been dismissed as destruction from fire now revealed patterns that could not be ignored. Bones were found clustered near the walls, not scattered as they should have been if panic alone had ruled the final moments. Several sets were positioned low, close to the ground, as if the men had been searching for air where none existed. One investigator knelt near the doorway, brushing ash away with gloved hands. The outline of the bolt imprint was still visible on the frame. Heat distortion had warped the metal, but it had not failed. It had held. They documented everything. Photographs, measurements, samples sealed into bags with careful labels. The work was slow and methodical, the kind that stripped emotion away and replaced it with certainty. Fires did not lie. They told their stories in chemistry and physics, not rumor. By midday, Harold Whitaker stood apart from the others, reading through notes while the wind tugged at his coat. The evidence aligned too cleanly now. Accelerant patterns near the base of the walls. Burn intensity inconsistent with accidental ignition. And the door, always the door, secured from the outside. He looked up toward the Barker house. It sat quiet on the hill, curtains drawn, windows reflecting the dull sky. It looked like any other farmstead in Laurel County. That was the danger of places like this. Violence hid well behind normalcy. Whitaker turned to the sheriff. "We're past speculation." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Then it's time." Word traveled fast in small places. By evening, neighbors were whispering again. Trucks slowed as they passed the Barker land. No one stopped. Respect had curdled into distance. Inside the house, Eli sat alone at the kitchen table. The chair across from him was empty. Simon had gone out back to split wood he didn't need. Noah paced the barnyard until his boots wore paths into the dirt. Martha stood at the sink, staring at her hands, submerged in cloudy water. She didn't look up when Eli's spoke. "They're coming." She dried her hands slowly. "I know." Outside, thunder rolled low across the hills. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, soaking the blackened ground where the barn had stood. Ash turned to mud. Bones sank deeper into the earth. And somewhere beneath it all, the truth waited, patient and unburned. The fog rolled in just before dawn. It settled thick over the fields, swallowing fence lines and trees, muffling sound until the world felt sealed off. By the time the state troopers turned onto the Barker Drive, their headlights cut pale tunnels through the gray. They came quietly. No sirens, no shouting, just engines idling low and doors opening with deliberate restraint. Eli was already awake. He sat on the porch with his coat on, boots laced east, hat resting on his knees. He had not slept. None of them had. The house behind him was dark, but he could feel the others there, waiting. The lead trooper approached first. His voice was calm, respectful. "Eli Barker, we have a warrant." Eli stood without hesitation. "I figured you would." Simon stepped out next, face drawn, eyes hollow. Noah followed, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Martha stood in the doorway, hands folded in front of her, saying nothing. The trooper read the charges aloud. Arson, murder, 10 counts. The words fell heavy into the fog, swallowed almost immediately, but their weight remained. Eli didn't argue, didn't protest. He turned, placed his hands behind his back, and waited for the cuffs. Metal clicked closed around his wrists, cold and final. Simon went quietly. Noah hesitated just long enough to look back at the house, at the land, at the hills that had shaped them. Then he stepped forward. As they were led to separate vehicles, a neighbor stood at the edge of the road, barely visible through the fog. He removed his hat as they passed. Whether it was respect or farewell, no one could say. Inside the car, Eli stared straight ahead. The road appeared and disappeared in patches, the world narrowing to what lay directly in front of him. He thought of his father, of the barns that once stood full and proud, of the moment when he had decided that survival mattered more than mercy. At the station, the paperwork took hours. Photographs, fingerprints, statements offered and declined. Eli said nothing beyond confirming his name. When they placed him in a holding cell, the fog had begun to lift outside. Morning light filtered through barred windows, pale and unforgiving. In the visiting room, Martha sat alone. She had not been allowed to see him yet. She clasped her purse and stared at the wall, listening to the distant echo of doors closing. Back at the farm, the land lay quiet. The fields were empty. The barn site was nothing but wet earth and scattered debris. A place that would never fully heal. By noon, the arrests were on the radio, then the television, then the papers. Laurel County absorbed the news the way it always did, slowly, painfully, with no clear consensus on what justice meant. And as the fog finally burned away, the Barkers were left exposed to a truth they could no longer outrun. The trial was held in Lexington, nearly 2 hours from Laurel County, far enough that the courthouse steps were unfamiliar, but not so far that people forgot who the Barkers were. The name carried weight in the courtroom, in the press, in the quiet spaces between neighbors who no longer looked each other in the eye. It began in early March. Cold winds swept through the city, rattling loose leaves across sidewalks and stirring tension that had been building for months. Journalists arrived with notepads and cameras, their voices hushed as they interviewed family members of the victims, old schoolmates of the Barker brothers, and anyone who would speak on record about what had happened that October night. The prosecution laid out the case like a puzzle already assembled. Accelerant patterns, forensic analysis, the twisted lock that could not have been fastened from inside, Margaret Ellis's letter was entered into evidence on the second day. Her voice shook when she read it aloud, but every word struck like a hammer. The room was still when she finished. Even the jury didn't move. The defense tried to argue uncertainty. No witnesses, no direct confession. A theory of a lantern explosion that had spiraled out of control. But it was too clean, too hollow. No one believed it. Not even the Barkers. Eli sat straight-backed at the defense table, expression unreadable. He wore a dark jacket and a shirt Martha had ironed carefully before the transport van came to take him to court. His hands stayed folded on the table in front of him, calm, unmoving. Simon looked down most of the time. His knuckles were red from gripping the sides of the chair. Noah stared forward with wide, glassy eyes, as if he was trying to hold his breath through the entire trial. When the fire marshal testified, he brought photographs, diagrams, science that couldn't be bent or softened. The jury listened. They asked questions. And slowly, piece by piece, the story became undeniable. On the sixth day, the prosecution called Jonah's sister to the stand. She was barely 20, with trembling hands and a voice barely louder than a whisper. She read from a letter Jonah had sent her the week before he died. In it, he described fear, pressure, talk among the workers that something terrible was coming. She broke down halfway through, and the judge had to call a recess. Outside, reporters swarmed. Inside, the Barkers sat in silence, the truth weighing heavier now than the handcuffs ever had. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom felt colder. The kind of cold that comes not from temperature, but from the realization that something sacred had been shattered and could not be repaired. The prosecutor stood and spoke plainly. This was not justice. It was vengeance. It was not an accident. It was execution. The jury didn't take long. They came back the next day with the verdict. Guilty. All three. On all counts. Eli Barker spoke only once after the verdict. It was during sentencing. The courtroom was packed again, the weight of the past 6 months heavy in the air. The judge gave him the chance. Eli stood slowly, looked not at the judge, but at the families seated behind the rail, the ones whose sons, husbands, brothers had died in his barn. His voice was gravel. You ruin a man's field, you ruin his family. That has to matter. He paused, looked down at his hands. But maybe I stopped being a man the night I stopped believing there was another way. He sat down. And that was the end of it. The judge sentenced all three brothers to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no cheers, no outbursts, just silence. The kind that wraps around everyone in the room and holds tight, making it hard to breathe. The next morning, the Barkers were transferred to separate facilities, Eli to one in central Kentucky, Noah to the east, Simon to the south. The state said it was for security, but everyone knew it was to keep them apart, to dismantle the unit that had held so firm for so long. Martha didn't attend the sentencing. She had said her goodbye the night before, hands resting on Eli's as the prison guards waited by the door. She didn't cry, just whispered, "I'll keep the porch light on." Anna Barker, now nearing 80, sat on her rocker as the news played on the small television inside. Her face didn't change. When the reporter said the word guilty, She reached for her Bible and closed it. She never opened it again. Back in Laurel County, the land stood unchanged. The hills still rolled gently across the horizon, the fields still caught sunlight in the morning. But the barn was gone, and no one planted tobacco on Barker land that spring. Neighbors stopped talking about it out loud, but the story settled into the dirt like old roots. You could feel it in the air. The weight of what had been done, the cost of silence. In town, there was a brief conversation about putting up a plaque, something small, respectful, maybe near the courthouse. But it was voted down. Too soon, some said. Too raw. But those who remembered did not forget. And those who came after could still feel it, in the way the road curved near the old Barker place, in the way the wind moved through the empty fields. Because some blood, no matter how deep it's buried, can't be unburned. Years passed, not fast, not slow, just steady. The way time moves, when nothing changes and everything does. Eli Barker became inmate number 35618. He wore a beige uniform, worked in the prison garden, and read the Bible in silence every morning before the others woke. He spoke little, never caused trouble. The guards respected his quiet. Inmates left him alone. There was something in his eyes that discouraged conversation. Not rage, something heavier. A quiet grief that had no end and no explanation he was willing to share. Simon worked in the laundry unit at his facility. He lost weight in the first year, his body shrinking under the weight of guilt. He stopped speaking for months, then began again in short sentences. Eventually, he started writing letters to his mother. Never long, always ending with the same line. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. Noah struggled the most. In the first year, he was placed on suicide watch twice. He rarely left his cell. He refused visitors. His hands shook constantly, and he developed a cough that echoed down the concrete halls. The youngest of the three had never been built for consequence. Back in Laurel County, the Barker land lay dormant. No crops grew that first spring. No one mowed the fields. The house stood dark most nights. Porch light off. Windows dusted with time. Martha moved into a small home in town, closer to her sister. She kept Eli's jacket folded neatly in a drawer and didn't speak his name again after the sentencing. Anna Barker died in her sleep 2 winters later. The obituary was short. No mention of the trial. No mention of the fire. Just her name, her children, and a quote from Psalms about justice rolling down like waters. The funeral was small, a few neighbors, some old church friends. Martha stood beside the casket with her hands clasped and her chin held high. She accepted condolences with grace, but no one stayed long. The air around the Barker name still burned. The graves of the 10 workers were marked with simple stones on the far end of the county cemetery. Donations had covered the cost. Small flowers sometimes appeared at the base of the headstones, lilies, wild violets, nothing extravagant. Just reminders that someone remembered. Margaret Ellis visited once a year. She would stand for 10 minutes in silence, then leave. She never remarried, never left Kentucky. Her home remained a quiet place filled with photographs and folded letters. The town carried on. It always does. The story faded from headlines, but not from memory. Children grew up hearing pieces of it, whispered through cracked windows and passed around campfires. The fire, the screams, the barn that locked itself from the outside. They said justice had been served, but no one felt better. Because justice doesn't restore, it just closes doors. And in the hills of Kentucky, some doors stay closed for generations. It's quiet now on Barker land. The fields have grown wild. Tall grass moves like water when the wind pushes through, and birds nest in the eaves of the long abandoned house. Ivy creeps up the porch columns. The mailbox leans, rust eating through the corners of the flag. Where the barn once stood, there is only earth. Scorched once, softened now by rain and time. But nothing grows there. Not weeds, not grass. Just soil that stays a shade darker than everything around it. Some say the land remembers. It's been over a decade since the fire, and yet the scars remain. Not just in the ground, but in the people. The Barkers became a story, part warning, part legend. Teenagers drive by late at night and dare each other to step onto the property. Most don't. The few who do say they hear things: footsteps in dirt, the sound of wood cracking, the faint echo of a scream. They say it's haunted, not by ghosts, but by guilt. In town, life moved on. New businesses opened. A mural was painted on the side of the old feed store. The county fair returned, but the name still lingered. Barker. People said it quieter now, like something holy or cursed. Every few years a reporter would revisit the story, an anniversary article, a podcast episode, a college student writing a thesis on Appalachian justice. But none of them captured the truth, because the truth wasn't just what happened that night in the barn. It was what came before. The hunger, the fear, the breaking of men under pressure they were never taught to name. The way a family that worked the same land for over a century chose fire when they could have chosen mercy. That was the real story. And it didn't end with a verdict. It didn't end with a sentence. It kept living in the eyes of those who stayed behind. One spring, a developer came through and offered to buy the property. Said he'd turn it into a campground. Cabins, fire pits, nature trails. Said it was a good piece of land with a lot of potential. Martha declined without hesitation. She still visited the house once a year, just to stand in the yard and remember. She'd bring a folding chair, sit near the steps, and listen to the wind. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just existed with it for a while. The final time she came, she brought a wooden cross and placed it where the barn had stood. No inscription, no name, just a mark. As if to say, someone lived here, someone died here, someone chose fire. And then she left. Didn't return again. Years from now, the house will collapse. The roof will give. The foundation will crack. The Barker name will fade from memory, for most. But the ground will remember. The earth doesn't forget heat, or ash, or blood. And when the wind moves just right through the trees across the field, it carries the sound of fire, still burning